So far, the Iranians have been very, very careful about their pursuit of nuclear weapons. They've proceeded by creeping forward, not by any really dramatic rush to acquire nuclear weapons. And I think that's because Iran recognizes the risk that they could provoke an attack from the United States or from Israel.
Gary Samore is Executive Director for Research at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. In December 2015, he was appointed as a member of the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board under Secretary Ernest Moniz and served until January 2017. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a member of the advisory board for United Against Nuclear Iran, a nonprofit organization that seeks to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. He served for 4 years in Obama's White House as Obama's White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. From 2006 to 2009, he was vice president for studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Before that, he was vice president for global security and sustainability at the MacArthur Foundation, and from 2001 to 2005, he was Director of Studies and Senior Fellow for Non-Proliferation at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Non-Proliferation and Export Controls during the Clinton administration. And before the National Security Council, he worked on non-proliferation issues at the State Department. In 1995, Gary Samore received the Secretary of Defense Medal for meritorious civilian service for his role in negotiating the 1994 North Korea nuclear agreement. Note to ask questions. Prior to the State Department, he worked at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and the RAND Corporation. He was a National Science Foundation fellow at Harvard University, where he received his MA and PhD in government in 1984. Gary Samore, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mary, for hosting me. Thank you, Ben, for making this great venue available. Thanks to all of you for coming out on this lovely spring evening. I don't know how much more rain I can take. We've had, I think Noah would be actually in envy now. So, as Mary said, I've been working in the field of trying to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons for over 30 years, inside and outside government. And I made a little list of all the countries that in my career I have worked on to try to prevent from acquiring nuclear weapons. And those include Argentina, Brazil, India, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, Pakistan, Syria, and Taiwan. And I think it's instructive to think about those cases in which we succeeded, countries like Argentina and Brazil or South Africa that decided to abandon their nuclear weapons efforts, and those countries where we failed, like India, Pakistan, and North Korea, and those countries where the jury's still out, like Iran. The current situation in the world is that 9 countries have nuclear weapons. The US, Russia, China, UK, France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. And of those 9 countries, none of them are prepared to give up their nuclear weapons. All of them see nuclear weapons as an essential element of their national security and foreign policy. And in fact, all of them, to one degree or another, are pursuing modernization and expansion of their, and/or expansion of their nuclear weapons forces, including, of course, the United States. But beyond those 9 countries, the number of additional countries that are seeking nuclear weapons is actually very limited. I mean, what's remarkable is that the threat of nuclear proliferation really doesn't exist in most of the world. In Europe, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, there are no countries that are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. The threat is really limited to the Middle East, where Iran's nuclear program puts pressure on other countries in the region to pursue nuclear weapons, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, and in Northeast Asia, where North Korea's program puts pressure on countries like South Korea and Japan to consider nuclear weapons. But outside of those two regions, nuclear proliferation is really not an international problem. It's limited to very specific regional questions. And the structure of the problem in the Middle East and Northeast Asia are really polar opposites. In the Middle East, the major constraint on additional countries acquiring nuclear weapons is really technical, that none of the countries in the region have a very strong indigenous scientific and industrial capacity to produce nuclear weapons. And in some of those countries, like Libya, Syria, and Iraq, they no longer exist as sovereign entities, and therefore they're in no position to pursue nuclear weapons programs. And the remaining countries like Saudi or Egypt and even Turkey have a number of significant financial and scientific limits, and in particular limits on human capital in terms of their ability to move toward the acquisition of nuclear weapons. The situation in East Asia is very different. All of the countries there have a very advanced scientific and technical capacity. They all have well-developed nuclear power programs, so there really aren't any significant technical constraints. If Korea or Japan or Taiwan decided to build nuclear weapons, they could do it fairly quickly, just like most European countries, because they have a very strong industrial and scientific base. The main constraint there is political, that those countries have a strong security relationship with the U.S., and I think as long as that security relationship survives, it put constraints on their perceived need to acquire nuclear weapons in order to defend themselves. As long as they can believe in the credibility of U.S. assurances, nuclear weapons are less important. So let me talk a little bit about the two issues that have been in the news, first Iran and then North Korea. And again, I think it's instructive to think about the differences between the two. In the case of Iran, we've been trying since the Reagan administration, since when I went into the government in 1984, to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And during most of that time, during most of my career, our focus was on trying to persuade other countries not to provide nuclear assistance to Iran. So in the course of, for almost 20 years, the focus was on persuading the Europeans, the Russians, the Indians, the Chinese, don't help Iran with nuclear technology because they can't be trusted, because they will use it to pursue nuclear weapons. And I think we were quite successful in being able to demonstrate that the Iranian government had aspirations to acquire nuclear weapons, and we were able to cut off most of the external nuclear assistance. Unfortunately, we missed one very important external supplier, which was Pakistan. And in the 1980s, Pakistan secretly provided Iran with the technology necessary for centrifuge enrichment, which is a way to produce fissile material that can be used for nuclear weapons. And sometime after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the first Gulf War, the Iranians decided to use that technology to try to build a secret enrichment plant, which was subsequently exposed in 2002. And both the Bush and then the Obama administration went about trying to build a strong international support for economic sanctions against Iran in order to try to force them to agree to limits on their nuclear program. And I think that strategy was successful. In January 2016, an agreement went into force between Iran and the so-called P5+1, which was an international coalition of the US, Russia, China, Germany, UK, France, and the EU. And the basic deal, the basic quid pro quo, is that Iran got sanctions relief, and in exchange, Iran accepted constraints on their nuclear program, constraints on their ability to produce fissile material, both separated plutonium and enriched uranium, as well as enhanced monitoring. So additional measures in order to verify that they were complying with the agreement. And even though the agreement was, of course, very controversial at the time, so far it has worked. So far, Iran has complied with the agreement, and the constraints on their program limit their ability to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons. And we have a verification mechanism of international inspectors that give us confidence that they're not cheating at their declared facilities, the facilities that the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, has access to. And so far, our intelligence agencies have not detected any cheating at covert sites, at undeclared sites. And of course, the U.S. cooperates very closely with allied intelligence agencies, UK, France, Israel, Germany, and so forth, in order to ensure that we can monitor Iran's nuclear activities. Now, because the agreement is working and because it has strong international support, the U.S. really doesn't have any practical option to abrogate the agreement or even to seek a massive effort to renegotiate the agreement. So even though candidate Trump was very critical of the agreement and at different times threatened to scrap it or renegotiate it, there really isn't any international support. And people in the White House and the State Department and Defense Department recognize that if the U.S. were to blow up the agreement by reimposing sanctions, we would find it very difficult to reconstruct the international support for sanctions, which made the deal possible in the first place. So I never thought it was a very practical option for the U.S. to tear up the agreement, as long as Iran is complying with it. And for the time being, it appears as though the Iranians are likely to continue to comply with the agreement because they want the benefit of sanctions relief. And I think no matter who wins in the presidential elections coming up in Iran, I think it's likely that Iran will continue to have an incentive to comply with the agreement in order to be able to sell their oil and have access to trade and finance with the Europeans and with the Russians and Chinese. So I think it's unlikely for the time being that either the U.S. or Iran will abrogate the agreement unilaterally. But at the same time, clearly the nuclear agreement is coming under a lot of strain. The Iranians complain that they're not getting the benefit of sanctions relief that they think they should under the agreement. And there's at least a possibility that some of the sanctions that were lifted under the agreement might be reimposed by Congress, and that would add strain on the agreement. The U.S. has some complaints about the agreement in terms of the details of the nuclear provisions. So one could imagine a situation where the deal unravels by death by a thousand cuts, not by a sudden abrogation. And on top of those complaints within the narrow limits of the deal itself, of course, the U.S. and Iran remain enemies in the Middle East in terms of competition between the U.S. and its allies and Iran for influence in the region. And the Trump administration has said that it's going to try to counter Iranian influence, and Iran has been able to benefit from the turmoil in the Arab world and from the U.S. invasion of Iraq in order to expand its influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and as well as Yemen. And it will be, so there's a risk, I think, that the agreement could come under strain by tension between the U.S. and Iran that has nothing to do with the nuclear elements of the agreement itself, but the broader areas of tension. For example, if there's a skirmish in the Persian Gulf between our Fifth Fleet and the Iranian, the IRGC Navy, that could put strain on the agreement, even if both sides are complying with the terms of the nuclear agreement. So I would say the longevity and survival of the nuclear deal is uncertain. Frankly, I think it would have been uncertain even if Secretary Clinton had won, because she made it clear that she was also going to try to counter Iranian influence in the region. If the deal falls apart, then I think much will depend on the circumstances that led to the collapse of the agreement. We will try to blame the Iranians and try to marshal international support to resume sanctions. The Iranians will try to blame the US and try to divide us from the Russians and the Chinese and the Europeans. And we may be back in a situation where it will take some time to reconstruct the international sanctions. And what the Iranians do in the meantime in terms of reviving their nuclear program will be an interesting question. So far, the Iranians have been very, very careful about their pursuit of nuclear weapons. They've proceeded by creeping forward, not by any really dramatic rush to acquire nuclear weapons. And I think that's because Iran recognizes the risk that they could provoke an attack from the United States or from Israel. So my expectation is that the Iranians would go back to this pattern of incremental progress in their nuclear program rather than a mad dash toward nuclear weapons that could lead to a strike against their nuclear facilities. Now let me talk about North Korea. As I mentioned, we've been trying, since the Reagan administration, when we first discovered that North Korea was building a small research reactor that we thought might be used to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. That was in 1984. The year I graduated and entered government. So we've been trying for more than 30 years to stop North Korea from developing nuclear weapons. And we've tried just about everything. We've tried, we've tried international and unilateral sanctions. We've tried military threats and intimidation. We've tried sabotage and covert operations. We've tried to negotiate agreements. We've had 3 nuclear deals with the North Koreans. Under Clinton, Bush, and Obama, the North Koreans violated or reneged on all of those agreements. In the course of the agreements, we've tried to, provide them with economic benefits, including light water reactors and heavy fuel oil and rice and even, baby crackers and formula. And, none of it has worked. So I think we have to recognize that the North Koreans currently have been able to acquire a small stockpile of nuclear weapons, probably a couple of dozen. They're probably able to deliver those nuclear weapons with their short-range and intermediate-range missiles. So that would cover targets throughout South Korea and Japan. And North Korea seems to be trying to acquire the ability to attack the United States directly. By developing longer-range missiles. Although I think it's very unclear how close they are to actually having that capacity, because they've never been able to test a missile of that length. So why did we fail? I think there are 3 reasons, and those 3 reasons I think will continue to be problematic for President Trump. First is, I think the North Koreans really going back to the founder of the dynasty, Kim Il-sung, have believed that nuclear weapons were essential for the survival of the North Korean state. The North Koreans see themselves as surrounded by powerful enemies. First of all, the United States, but in addition to that, China and Japan and South Korea. And the North Koreans believe that having nuclear weapons is necessary to fend off those enemies, so that they will leave North Korea alone. And I frankly think that there's nothing we can do to reassure or appease North Korea. I don't think there's any pledges we could make or any benefits we could offer them that would convince them that they don't need to have their own capacity to defend themselves with nuclear weapons. And, as I said, I think that conviction has been bred into 3 generations of the Kim dynasty. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. And so I think we can't really, resolve the fundamental motivation that North Korea has for having nuclear weapons. The second reason why we failed is because there are real limits on our ability to bring economic and political pressure on North Korea. In part, that's due to the character of the North Korean regime. I mean, unlike Iran, it simply is not as vulnerable to economic or political pressure. It's a very, very hard nut to crack. It's an extremely, regimented police state where very little, dissidence is tolerated, and it's fairly impervious to international sanctions. And in addition, China, which is the country that really holds the key to North Korea's economy, has never been willing to utilize the kind of economic pressure that could threaten to crush the North Korean economy and could bring about instability or conflict. Although I will say in the last couple of years, the Chinese have moved much more in the direction of being willing to support strong international sanctions than they ever were before. And this is mainly in reaction to Kim Jong-un's behavior, because he continues to carry out nuclear and missile tests that the Chinese oppose. So the last two UN Security Council resolutions, for the first time, imposed sanctions on North Korea's general economy, in this case exports of coal and other minerals. So I think there's more room for China to work with us than there's ever been in the past. But China still is constrained by its fear that too much pressure will lead to instability and explosion on the Korean Peninsula, which the Chinese don't want. And the third reason we failed is because we just don't have any practical military options. Even if we carried out a strike against North Korea's nuclear and missile facilities, we have very little confidence that we could destroy all of those facilities. Some of them are hidden. And in any event, North Korea always has the option of retaliating, especially against Seoul, which is within artillery range of the DMZ. So our ability to take effective military action against North Korea is very limited. And that means that it really weakens our ability to coerce North Korea. Again, unlike Iran, where the military option may not have been desirable, but we had a real military option. We could have destroyed all of Iran's nuclear facilities, and Iran had very little ability to retaliate, even against U.S. allies in the region, because we had such a strong, conventional posture. So what is Trump doing? The policy, of course, Trump administration has said that the policy of the Obama administration of strategic patience is over, and they have a new slogan. So their policy is maximum pressure and engagement. And we're now in the maximum pressure phase. So the Trump administration is trying to use military intimidation and threats of sanctions and working with China to discourage Kim Jong-un from carrying out additional missile and nuclear tests. Well, we'll see whether or not that's successful. To some extent, I hope Kim Jong-un goes ahead with another nuclear test, because I think if he did, the Chinese would be willing to support an even stronger UN Security Council sanction against North Korea. In fact, in the Chinese press, there's talk about a resolution that would limit Chinese oil exports to North Korea, which would be a very powerful sanction. But at the end of this kind of pressure phase, the Trump administration hopes to pivot to a negotiation where we would come to an agreement with the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for sanctions relief and maybe some economic benefits from South Korea. There are currently presidential elections that will take place in South Korea, and the new government in Seoul is very likely to be more willing to resume economic cooperation than the previous government. So one could imagine a package of sanctions relief, economic assistance. Maybe we could start peace talks, something the North Koreans have said they wanted, in exchange for steps by the North Koreans to limit their nuclear program, starting perhaps with a moratorium on nuclear and missile testing, and then moving to more significant steps like limits on fissile material production, and ultimately, at the end of the day, in the distant future, maybe North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons. As you can tell, I don't have much confidence that this is going to work, but I also don't think there's a better idea out there. And if at the end of the day, the Trump administration is able to even buy some years through a moratorium, which would delay testing and therefore delays North Korea's ability to build up its nuclear and missile capability, I think that would be a positive achievement and maybe the best thing we can do through diplomacy. And in the meantime, as I said, I think we have a very good capacity to continue to work with our allies in East Asia, Korea, and Japan to to reinforce their conviction that they don't need to build their own nuclear weapons in order to defend themselves because they have the benefit of U.S. protection. So I'll end there and be very happy to listen to your comments and any questions. Yes, sir.
Actually, so for questions, Tom Luai has got, about to get a handheld mic. He'll come around, he's out of the way. He'll come around with a handheld mic and let your question be a question.
Yes, sir. Yes, this person, and yes. And then you had.
First of all, since you talked about two countries, Iran and North Korea, I have two questions, one on each.
Right. All right.
So I'll start with Iran first. One of the things that seems to be disturbing the current administration is not just the deal regarding their compliance, as you stated, to not a fissile material, but to have a credible nuclear threat, you need fissile material, but you also need a delivery system.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're seeing them do is develop the capacity to improve their long-range missiles. I see a lot of failures on the North Korean side. I don't see a lot of failures in testing short, medium, and long-range missiles on the Iranian side. So I'd like you to address that in terms of the concern. And then regarding the Korean situation, you mentioned something I found surprising. You said that that North Korea sees China as a potential threat.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm surprised at that is historically, North Korea actually was very much allied with China, not just in the North Korean War, but in the Chinese War in 1948 against Chiang Kai-shek. They supplied a lot of men and material that helped them to overthrow Chiang Kai-shek and established, and supported Mao Zedong. So I'm surprised to hear you say that. And I've heard other people say that really what China wants is a close relationship with North Korea because in case they long-term have an issue with us, they continue to supply them with that material.
So both very good questions. On the Iranian missile program, one of the concessions we made as part of the negotiation in the deal is to loosen the UN edicts against Iran conducting tests and other activities with their ballistic missile program. So we don't have, the language is, ambiguous, so lawyers could disagree, but I think the Iranian lawyers would have a much better argument than our lawyers would have that their missile testing is contrary to the UN Security Council resolutions. Sometimes people say that it's contrary to the spirit of the deal. I have no idea what that means. I don't think these deals have spirit. They have, quid pro quo, right? And that's it. And this deal, it's a mistake to see the U.S.-Iran deal as a precursor to, better relations between the U.S. and Iran. I think we continue to be fundamentally at odds on a very broad range of issues. And this agreement is basically, a way to temporarily park the nuclear problem for some period of time. So the Iranians, as you say, are proceeding with their ballistic missile program, and I think that we can't credibly argue that it's against the agreement or against UN Security Council resolutions. We can continue to sanction their ballistic missile activity, as both President Obama did after the deal went into force and as President Trump has done. So we can identify individuals and entities associated with Iran's ballistic missile program and sanction them. But frankly, that's not going to make much of a difference. Those sanctions are not likely to force the Iranian government to stop. We can certainly try to deny them access to external materials that are necessary for their ballistic missile program. We can do whatever sabotage and covert operations we're capable of carrying out. But I think we have to recognize that their ballistic missile program is going to proceed. And from their standpoint, they're a country without a significant air force because of the arms embargo that's been in place since 1979, since the revolution. So from their standpoint, having conventionally armed ballistic missiles actually is a real military asset for them. And I remember in the Obama administration when we were doing the sort of preparations for the possibility of carrying out airstrikes against Iran, our military people were much more worried about their ballistic missile threat, conventionally armed, against Israel or against Saudi than anything else Iran has in its inventory. So I would just say their ballistic missile program is one of the concessions we made to get the nuclear deal. On North Korea, the threat that they see from China is not a military threat. It's not invasion. It's subversion. I mean, the Chinese are very unhappy with Kim Jong-un. They think he's irresponsible. They think that he ignores Chinese interests. They think he's resistant to the kind of reforms the Chinese would like to see, as they've been able to carry out in their country to, have a vibrant economy yet maintain a one-party system. And of course, the Chinese have harbored, other pretenders to the throne. I mean, Kim Jong-nam, who was recently assassinated in Kuala Lumpur, he was under Chinese protection in Macau. And Kim Jong-nam's son, who's the now oldest surviving member of the Kim dynasty, is also in Macau under Chinese protection. So in some ways, I think the threat from China to Kim Jong-un is probably more serious than the American threat. Because at the end of the day, I think it's very unlikely we're going to attack North Korea. But I could imagine a Chinese plot, a coup d'etat or an assassination that, if I were Kim Jong-un, that would keep me up at night much more than an American invasion. And some of the things that have taken place in North Korea in recent years, like the arrest and execution of his uncle, Cheng Song-taek, was seen as, at least in part, a move to curtail Chinese influence in the royal court. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're next. Yes, I'm sorry. I forgot. No.
You've answered in part one of my questions, which was, what do you think the implications of regime change would be? I can't think of any examples where we've been successful in that particular approach, but here I wondered what your thoughts would be there. And the second one is a less serious question, but there have been a number of TV programs recently showing North Korea, and I must say I've been impressed by the quality of the cities anyway.
Yeah.
And we keep talking about what a poor country it is, but you can't build those skyscrapers and clean up even one city without substantial resources, and I just wonder where they come from.
Yeah. It's a very good question. The North Korean regime is a truly hateful regime. I mean, if I could, somehow orchestrate regime change, I wouldn't hesitate 1 minute. But I just don't think we have the means to, bring about political change without China being willing to cooperate with political and economic pressure. I just don't think it's possible. And at this point, a spontaneous uprising, a kind of color revolution, just seems very implausible to me because it's such a brutal police state. And outside of the cities, where life does seem to be okay, people are living in such dire poverty and desperation that I don't think, political reform is, they're more worried about getting something to eat than that. But it is true that in, especially the capital city, Pyongyang, there does seem to be a bit of some economic well-being and growth and access to international goods. The North Koreans are experimenting with some very modest free market reforms. So there are, fruit and vegetable markets, and people can trade in goods that they get from China, including, Western, consumer goods. So I think that the North Koreans have many different forms of revenue. Some of them are illicit. I mean, they are very active in the drug trade and counterfeit money. They sell weapons, of course, but they do sell a lot of raw materials. I mean, it's a commodity-driven market. I mentioned coal and other minerals. And they're very good at evading sanctions. I mean, the North Koreans have really made an art since they've been sanctioned for so many decades. They really have, done a very good job of figuring out ways to get around it. Now, that doesn't mean we can't bring more economic pressure to bear, but we just have to recognize that it's likely to be a very long process. And as I said, it's not a system that's very susceptible to external pressure because outside of the elite, they're not vulnerable to public opinion. I mean, again, unlike Iran, where you really do have public opinion and the government can't just ignore the middle class. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
You told us where the Iranians got their nuclear technology from Pakistan. But how did the North Koreans get started?
Right, it's a very good question. So of course, their program has had both a plutonium and an enrichment component. Now, the plutonium component, this research reactor that we discovered in 1984, that's based basically on Russian technology. So the Russians, back in the days of the Cold War, when there was a communist bloc, the Russians provided the basic nuclear technology that China used for its nuclear weapons program and that North Korea used for its nuclear weapons program. But this is dual-use technology. I mean, it's technology that can be used for research reactors and power as well as nuclear weapons. Now, the enrichment program from North Korea also came from Pakistan. In the early 1990s, I remember this well because we didn't discover it until many, but in the 90s, basically there was a trade. The North Koreans provided Pakistan with intermediate range missiles, and the Pakistanis provided North Korea with both enrichment technology and nuclear weapons technology. So, unfortunately, Pakistan, back in this period, has been very active in spreading nuclear weapons technology, not just to Iran and North Korea, but also to Libya. The Libya nuclear weapons program, which was dismantled under President Bush, that's all based on Pakistani technology. And they offered it around to other countries as well, to Iraq and others, but they were turned down. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mary, if you want.
Any women have questions? Anyway. I thought you already went.
He hasn't. Go ahead, you have the mic.
Yes, I'll be quick. I don't even need the mic. Since the Obama administration left power, there have been a number of disclosures about how Ben Rhodes had set up his echo chamber.
Right.
And even recently in Politico, which is, I would say, a left-of-center online journal, there was a recent article by Josh Meyer, which disclosed that a lot of things were hidden from the American public. For example, the Obama administration dropped charges against a number of Iranians who were fugitives, who had Interpol warrants on them, who were involved in a process to try to procure parts to basically supply Iran's surface-to-air missile program, cruise missiles. I mean, I understand there's a deal in place, but sometimes it's a situation where the legacy isn't important. Getting the right deal is correct. And here we have a situation in which I think the Obama administration, probably for very good reason, failed to disclose the fact that the $1.7 billion was released, and they're dropping warrants against people who endanger American security. Is there some point where you don't let people off the hook just for the legacy?
So I think my involvement in the sort of debate about the Iran nuclear issue was over the terms of the nuclear deal. Were they sufficient? Did they achieve the purpose of capping and limiting Iran's nuclear capacity, and did we have the verification tools in order to assure compliance? There were other side deals that were involved, but I think that everybody knew the basic elements of the nuclear deal itself. I mean, there were some details that were only provided to Congress that were not made public, although, like everything else in Washington, they subsequently leaked, or we had a pretty good idea what they were. So I think that the debate on the merits of the nuclear deal per se, there was enough information public to have an honest and fair debate on that. As it turns out, like most things in Washington, it became completely partisan. I mean, not a single Republican voted in favor of the deal, and the only reason why the deal survived is because enough Democrats were willing to support it, which I think is a very unfortunate tendency in our foreign policy. But the fact that there were other elements of the deal, and I don't know the particular details, I mean, there was some kind of a prisoner swap involved where we got some of our people back, and in exchange we allowed these Iranians either in prison or who were under indictment to go back. That was one of the side deals that was part of the agreement. It doesn't bother me so much as long as we're getting what we need on the nuclear side. And as I say, so far the nuclear parts of the agreement are working.
Two more questions.
Okay. Yes, sir. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This guy has it, and then go ahead. Sorry, it's my fault. I'm not doing a good job.
So I have two good questions, but if you want to just take one, please feel free. So the first thing you said about North Korea is that they believe that nuclear weapons are essential to survival to their regime or to their state because they're surrounded by enemies, and that there's really nothing that we can do otherwise. So given your experience in government, how could that not be sort of a legitimate concern for them if they can observe Iraq, Libya, Ukraine,
Right.
you give up your nuclear weapons, you're
Right.
subject to invasion, territorial loss of territorial integrity. So just to comment on that, and if you could, so in the 1950s, 60s, there was a debate on nuclear weapons, permanent con, ladder of escalation. You can use nuclear weapons tactically.
Right.
Shelling came with you
Right.
to use them. Who knows what's going to happen? So between the tactical use of nuclear weapons and strategic use of nuclear weapons, do you have a sense of where President Trump and his people, where they fall in that sort of debate?
All right, both good questions. I mean, when I describe North Korea's view of the world, I'm just describing the way it is. And I think it's, as I said, I think it can't be changed. I think they're deeply paranoid. And even paranoids have enemies because, as I said, even if they didn't have nuclear weapons, this is a horrible regime. We would like to see them overthrown. So I totally get it. I completely understand why they feel that they must have nuclear weapons. It's the same with Pakistan, Israel, India, any country that has nuclear weapons. They don't do it for trivial reasons. They do it because they're including the United States. They do it because they're convinced they're necessary. And I just think that's a fact of life in international politics, and no country that has nuclear weapons is going to be persuaded that they don't need them, at least under current circumstances. On your question about tactical and strategic, that really bears on U.S.-Russian and NATO-Russian relations, because the Russians have, I'm sure you're aware of this, the Russians have announced this doctrine. They call it escalate to de-escalate, which is basically because they think they have conventional inferiority with respect to NATO. The Russians are looking at, if a war breaks out in Eastern Europe, let's say over the Baltics, and we're losing, how can we use tactical nuclear weapons in order to end the conflict or to, negate NATO's conventional superiority? And the Russians have many, many tactical weapons, much more than the U.S. does. And I think because of that, I think the U.S., and I mean the Trump administration, is looking at how do we develop doctrine, posture, exercises to convince the Russians that the use of tactical nuclear weapons won't work. That either we have the ability to counter with tactical nuclear weapons against military targets in Russia, or once, as you say, and I think Schelling's right, once you start throwing nuclear weapons around, it's very hard to avoid escalation to full nuclear war, which obviously would destroy everybody. But so I do think in the nuclear posture review that the Trump administration is doing, I would expect to see some attention paid to the U.S. doing things, maybe not deploying any new weapons, but at least doing exercises or declaratory statement that would be a direct response to what we see as an increasing Russian reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. Okay, yes, sir.
I have a question. And the gentleman before asked a question relative to regime change and so on. He alluded to that. Yeah, so just if I look at what happened in the Middle East in the last few years, coming into Iraq, then to Libya, it's a disastrous approach to regime change. Why would we expect that to be any different if we went to Korea with a similar approach? That's one. Two, if China is going to be pushing Korea around on our behalf, it doesn't make sense. They will only do it if it is of benefit to them.
Right.
And I think right now, North Korea is a dagger in the Chinese arm. They will use it as they see fit.
Right.
So is that an analogy that you would accept? So, two, I just want to ask the second question quickly. You mentioned Iran and you mentioned 1984 A.Q. Khan, without the name, that he really gave them the Pakistani principles.
Right.
I argue it goes all the way back to the Atoms for Peace under the Eisenhower administration. It led to the 1970s, by the French support, creating the very first research reactor in Iran. We actually, American scientists, went to Iran and trained them on that. So what I'm actually leading you to the following. It was probably incorrect to state that they don't have the intellectual power to do it. They always have. the Shah of Iran created a very strong intellectual elite on the nuclear level in Iran.
Yes.
And then when Khomeini came to power, he destroyed that, but then it came back because they needed it.
Right.
So what's your response?
Yeah. So I think you're right that Iran's nuclear program, including its interest in potentially developing nuclear weapons, really goes back to the Shah, and it was disrupted by the revolution. The difference between Atoms for Peace and what the Iranians were doing is that we were providing open nuclear technology under international safeguards for experimentation and isotope production. You can't use the little research reactors, little 5-megawatt light water research reactors, to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. They simply aren't powerful enough. So they're basic, scientific tools. What the Pakistanis were providing, A, it wasn't secret. B, there were no safeguards whatsoever. And C, it was specifically intended for the production of weapons-grade uranium. So I don't see any comparison, I'm sorry, between what we did and what Pakistan did. I'm sorry, what was the other question?
On Korea, and it's
yeah. So look, I think the Chinese are acting. China's a big power, right? We can't push them around. They're acting in their own self-interest. They recognize that North Korea developing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles damages China's security because it gives the U.S. opportunities to strengthen our security relationships with Korea and Japan in East Asia, and also to build up regional missile defense, which the Chinese see as a direct threat to their nuclear deterrent. So, for example, the Chinese are very upset about Korea's decision to allow the U.S. to deploy the THAAD anti-missile system. And the reason why the Korean government agreed to that is because of North Korea. So the Chinese are, the pressure they're putting on North Korea, partly it's to avoid conflict and to try to create the possibility of a diplomatic solution. But China shares with the U.S. a desire to at least limit and, if possible, disarm North Korea's nuclear program. Can we have one more? Is that all right?
A question.
I'll probably regret it, but...
Two really quick questions. One, at what point, what is the minimum threshold of change that we would need to see in North Korea to return to the six-party talks,
right.
Perhaps reward them with negotiations?
Right.
And second, what should China do to pressure North Korea into either negotiations or cooperation? Is it cutting off their oil? Is that
right.
what will really make a difference? And is that what we see happening this week?
Right. So I can't answer your second question. I don't know what is necessary. It may very well be that Kim Jong-un is determined to proceed with his nuclear and missile program until he demonstrates the ability to actually field a long-range missile that could strike the United States, and only then, from a position of strength, would he be willing to negotiate. So I can't tell you what the magic lever is that China could employ that would cause North Korea to agree to negotiations. Your first question is very important because it concerns the conditionality for talks. And in the last 3 years of the Obama administration, we were demanding a very high conditionality. We were saying unless North Korea takes concrete steps to convince us that they're serious about nuclear negotiations, we're not going to talk to them. And that included that they had to declare all their secret nuclear facilities and allow inspections and so forth. Now, I always thought that was a pretty unrealistic demand. And I think one of the challenges for the Trump administration after they finish their maximum pressure campaign, they're going to have to decide what is the price? What is the basis on which we're prepared to enter into negotiation with North Korea? As a practical matter, I hope they agree to lower conditions than Obama did, because I'm afraid if we demand too much, you'll never get negotiations started.
All right, well, lots of food for thought.
Thank you.